Hi everyone. So we're going to start looking at watercolor painting today. Here are your watercolor paints in a tray that's going to look very similar to what you have. Hopefully you have a full amount of color. You can see in the lid, that's where I actually use the palette to mix colors and thin them down and just have an additional painting work surface for myself. So this is the standard brush that you should be working with. Hopefully your watercolor set comes with something like this brush. If not, you may want to pick up your own brush that you should find in the store along with this watercolor palette. You definitely want something that's soft bristled and is kind of this size to work with for all the painting work we're about to do. So you're also going to see in my work area, I've got my paper around me, I've got a paper towel off to the side, I've got a pencil ready to go, and of course my water cup. You're going to notice that these things are off to my right side, which we'll get to in a second why that is. But you don't need a very large area to work. As long as you have something like this set up for yourself, you will be good. You might want to protect that surface though that you're painting on, just make sure it's waterproofed. So I'm going to start by wetting my brush. That's how we're going to get going. I'm just going to kind of get it in, swish it in the container. But the first thing you want to do is think about how you're controlling the water, the amount that's on that brush. So I can drag it across the lip of this cup and kind of, get some excess water off that way. I can also take it and, you'll see me do this in a second, dry it off on the paper towel. But notice how, everything again is off to the right side, so I can easily reach my paint and my palette right next to me as I begin to work. And here I'm going to demonstrate how I easily can reach across my paper and just grab that paper towel and dry that brush off and get excess water in that way as well. So this is the basic setup that you want to have, something that looks like this, but that you're comfortable. You have all of your tools and things you're going to need, so you're not going to have to get up and run across the room as you're painting. So we're just going to make sure and make some adjustments so you can see. So here's another don't do this. In the room, normally we go over this especially, but you never want to leave your brush sitting in the water container and just walk away. Or as you're doing something else, maybe you're waiting for something to dry on your paper, because that can damage the brush. It can make the bristles start to fall out of the brush. It also could make them be shaped in this curved way because they're resting, gravity brush down. And that's really not good for your brush. So you always want to leave it when you're not using it, actually just dry it off and leave it on the table next to you like that. So I'm going to take my pencil and just very lightly sketch out 8 boxes across my paper. You don't have to do this, but the exercises you're about to do, I'm asking you to do 8 of them. So you might want to just divide up your paper and just make sure you're giving yourself enough space for all of those different things you're about to try out and practice. You may need to practice in your sketchbook paper or just give yourself room to really play and kind of, we'll just say, make a mess, then actually work on a second piece of paper for your techniques. So that's what I'm going to jump in and do right now. I'm just going to use that little bit of water that's on my brush, start to get it wet my palette a bit, and then just start to practice. What is it going to look like as I just make a brush stroke with just, that kind of decent amount of water on my paint, picking up a medium amount of paint on my brush as that goes down my paper. Now I'm going to pick up more paint directly from my paint tin, from the source color, not from the palette, and let's see what that looks like. So that's much darker, much darker value, more paint there. And as you can see, it's interesting. You can see, how the flow of the paint and the color pigment runs down the paper. And when you lift your brush, there's like this little pool of more pigment sitting there at the bottom of the brush stroke. That's something that you might pay attention to. You may like that effect, you may not. There's ways to deal with that in terms of whether you want to leave that or kind of remove some of that from your painting as you work. So now let's test out, what happens with my paper as I consider my paper is dry. I'm going to pick up a little bit more paint, wet my brush a little bit, and I want to start to spread more of this paint across this paper and kind of get a field of color. Let's see what that's going to look like. So I'm going to try that out. So that is dry paper a decent amount of paint and just going fairly quickly overlapping my brush strokes. So I have decided I don't necessarily love that little puddle that gets left of excess paint. So I'm gonna actually use my brush to suck it up and then just take that excess paint and dry it onto that paper towel there. So let's see what that does for me. Yep. See, so it's soaking into the paper and I'm kind of getting rid of some of the impact of that. And as this paint and water settles into the paper and it starts to dry, some of the splotchiness is starting to go away. But, you know, it's not perfectly even. And part of that is because my paper surface was dry. And so as I make brush strokes and move my brush across that paper, it soaks in this kind of not completely even way. So a way to start to make the paint be more evenly distributed is to do what I'm doing right now. I'm going to actually now make my paper wet. I've added clean water to my paper, made sure it's fairly even. I'm going to let it soak in, and now I'm going to again quickly work down that paper, let it soak in a little bit, overlap my brush strokes, and see what that starts to look like. And as you see, it's starting to spread evenly across that paper surface and really soak in and spread because I had that layer of water sitting there first to really kind of open up the pores of that paper and allow that color to just soak in. So these are called washes, but you can have a dry wash, which means the paper is dry before you start to apply that field of color, or you can have a wet wash, which means I have pre-wetted down that paper and then added my color. Of course, that means that the color may be a little bit lighter in value because that water is going to spread that pigment and soak it into the paper faster. So you have to be careful of that. You know, washes, especially wet washes, tend to be for that really just light application of color in your background just to get you going, especially with watercolor painting. So now I've tried out these basics and I've at least learned a little bit about how the paint works on my paper. Now I can jump into some of those exercises that you guys are going to practice. So the first one we're going to look at is the idea of the wash. And I'm again going to wet my entire area that I want the wash to go in and just try to evenly distribute that water across my paper surface. Then I'm going to let the water soak in a little bit and just dry a little bit. Then I'm going to pick up a little bit more color and, but water it down, get it to the consistency and value that I want. And again, I'm going to start moving across my paper surface, kind of overlapping my brush strokes a bit, working out any streaks I have, but also moving quickly across the paper. So picking up those little puddles of paint where I ended the last brush strokes, and again, just trying to evenly distribute that color across my paper. But I'm also not going to kill it. I'm not going to overwork it. I'm just going to say, well, I've really worked it a bit. I'm going to let it start to soak in and just do its thing. So just picking it up so you guys can see it. So that's fairly even. Is it perfect? Perfect? No. But again, as it dries and soaks into that paper, you'll get to see that it really does just look like, again, this wash of color. That's a very light value, but that's okay. Because this, in a painting, that would be your first layer. That would just be for your background, maybe. But that's my goal. I want it to look something like this, where it's not so streaked and uneven in terms of the value of the color and seeing those brush strokes. So now I'm going to ramp it up and move to that next thing we're going to work on, which is having what I call a variegated, but really it's a value change in the paint. So I'm going to pick up a lot of raw color with not a ton of water right away. For this one though, I'm not going to wet my paper. I'm actually going to work on dry paper, and I'm going to change it up how I thin that paint on my paper. So first I want to test, is it the value that I want? Yeah, that's looking really nice and dark. I'm going to start up at the top of my box area that I've marked out for myself. And I'm just going to lay down this really nice dark stroke across the top of that box for really rich color. I'm going to pick up some more. And here's where I'm going to do something different. I'm going to now wet my brush with a lot of water, not add any more paint, and just work with what's on my paper and really kind of thin it and water it down on the paper itself. So as I do this, you might notice like the paint's moving a little bit, but it's a little bit streaked. So now I'll have to go back in and so there's the reminder of where Miss Level is as she works on this video. So I'm just going to go back in and work that seam of where I had the real darkest dark happening and really try to transition it more smoothly. I'm going to go in and really dry that brush and maybe now remove some of the excess color out of there so I can really start to get that value change and stretch it out. So this is where, this is where you're going to start pushing your chops and abilities, but see, what happens as you're working that paintbrush across that paper and it gets absorbed into that paper surface. And what strokes can I still see? How fast do I need to move? You do want to be careful about overworking your paper though. So it's a really fine line between I really need to put some more strokes in and start evening out what's happening with this variegated change in value with my colors, but I don't want to overwork it too much where I just really start losing paint off that paper, and you can actually start to the paper will start to get little bumps and start to fall apart actually if you overwork watercolor paper. So this is the kind of thing that you have to try many, many times and really just practice and get a handle of. And over time you get better and better, and then you can do it very quickly and get the result you want. So if it doesn't look the way you really want it to, but you've already gone over the same spot, we'll say 3, 4, 5 times, you're just going to have to leave it and walk away. It will get better next time with practice. So now I'm going to look at the idea of actually I want to blend 2 colors together. Instead of just this, I'm going to change the value of one color. I want to play with that idea of, well, what happens when I work with 2 and they come together and blend together in the middle? So I'm going to work with this orange and just kind of play with the color of that orange a little bit. I like the way it looks with a little bit of the purple added in, even a little bit of that brown up there. So I've just changed the quality of that orange a little bit. For this one, I actually am going to lightly wet the paper just a bit before I work because I want to have that paint really move on that paper surface. But I'm going to be careful about overworking it. So what I'm doing right now is just kind of evening out that water I put down. So just taking my purple, I'm going to start. And for the purposes of this video, I'm working very fast. If I was doing this in my own time, I might not work quite this quickly. I'd slow it down a little bit, but I'm just trying to give you guys a good taste and experience to get you going. And then you're going to have to jump in and test it out for yourself. So here's my 2 colors. Now I need to just bring this orange into the purple, but I don't want to go all the way to the edge of my purple. I still want to maintain both colors. I'm going to let that soak in a little bit, but then as you can see, it's very streaked here. So I might not love that. So I might come back in and try to work it. But here's what starts to happen. So sometimes, sometimes you can start to do things and be like, I thought I was going to fix it and I just made it worse. So for a minute here, I'm going to make it worse. And you're going to see how I start to correct that and walk back from that. I waited a little bit and then that brush became almost like an eraser and I erased color off my paper, but then I went back in, added a little more, softened that transition, and now I can kind of even it out a bit more. But you do want to be careful about that. See, now I'm overworking it on purpose for you guys. So I'm just like more and more brush strokes. I'm just picking up more of the paint. It's not necessarily helping me out. I don't love the way this is looking. So this is that example of what does happen or can happen if you really do just push it too far. So now I'm going to reintroduce some more paint and spread that across and have it reabsorb that color into that paper to bring it back to kind of the value I want. So yeah, and you can see here, look at the roughness of that paper now. It's lost kind of that nice textured look, and it's just starting to get really fuzzy. So be careful of those things as you work, guys. Just try out the rest of the techniques and see how you do. Examples are posted.